It is now my pleasure to introduce Killeen Hanson. Killeen is a designer, a researcher based in Brooklyn, New York. She is a founder and editor of the Sombra Mesa Reading Club, a publication and discussion series organized around an evolving library of individually bound primary sources from voices, viewpoints, and geographies, both iconic and overlooked. She teaches design research and theory within the School of Design Strategies at Parsons School of Design in New York City, and consults as a thought partner and design strategist for individuals and organizations pushing boundaries of what is and what can be. Killeen's ongoing research projects and collaborations explore the power of attention, how communities make meaning collaboratively, and the relationship between education, publication, and civic engagement. She was recently an artist fellow at the New York Public Library, where she experimented with combining, layering, and interpreting images from their 115-year-old picture collection. We welcome her today to talk about how combinatory research unearths fresh perspectives, jumpstarts research, and challenges assumptions. Welcome, Killeen.
Thank you, Nora. All right. As Nora said in that lovely introduction, my name is Killeen. You heard a little bit about what I'm doing these days. I'm a professor at Parsons School of Design in New York City, where I teach in the Strategic Design and Management program and the Transdisciplinary Design program. My training is in literature, in cartography, and in craft. I started as an English major, which may be a little relevant later on, and have ended up as a designer. This, by the way, is a picture of my graduate studio, which was basically a pirate ship that we built for ourselves over the course of 2 years. My small studio was up there in the loft. I also maintain a design practice, like Nora referenced, that facilitates community-based engagement and guides participants through the process of making sense together across text, image, and material. And most recently, I was an artist fellow in the New York Public Library's picture collection, which is located in this extraordinary building on Fifth Avenue in New York, where I live and teach. And it's out of that residency that the exercise I'm going to share with you later this morning are first emerged. And so a little background about the picture collection, because this will be relevant later on. The picture collection is basically analog Google image search. It was founded in 1915 and was and remains an incredibly essential resource for artists, set designers, journalists, illustrators, you name it, to find image references. Part of what sets it apart is that the collection is divided among thousands and thousands of folders, each holding prints, advertisements, drawings, vintage postcards, and other ephemera. And it's important that to know that the picture collection is sorted by category rather than by artist or media type. So you can pull a folder for shadows. You can pull a folder for Tokyo Street Life, 1970. You can pull a folder for scent. Some of those synesthetic folders are particularly fascinating. But no matter what hat I'm wearing, I see my work as creating occasions for people to find connections between diverse ideas and media, and to pull forward an idea we've already heard, creating occasions for people to stumble across serendipity. In my experience, this is more likely when we step out of our usual patterns and try on new ways of working. And so I'm excited to share with you a new way of working that you can add to your existing research practices. So let's get to the heart of why we're here. As we've established, the title of my talk is How Combinatory Research Unearths Fresh Perspectives, Jumpstarts Research, and Challenges Assumptions. It's entirely true. It's exactly what we're going to talk about. But it's also a bit long. My main point today is more simple. Great things happen when we mash ideas together, where the whole is more than the sum of its parts. A perfect example of the generative power of combinatory research comes from Vladimir Nabokov's masterpiece, Lolita. And this is the moment when I ask you to remember that I was a college English major. In the 5th paragraph of the book, so very early on, right in the beginning, the protagonist, Humbert Humbert, describes the moment he was orphaned. He writes, "My very photogenic mother died in a freak accident, picnic, lightning, when I was 3. 2 words paint the whole scene. We don't need any other details to imagine the moment, the sounds, the tears, the terror, the surprise. It's all there. in 2 words, or more precisely, in the gap between the 2 words. I thrive in paying attention to how things relate to each other, in paying attention to the gap. Paying attention is hard work. I think a lot of us are fascinated by what happens in gaps. We light up when we get to zoom in, go deep, look beneath the surface. It's hard because it's hard to name sensations, to put words to instincts or impressions, to describe messy, scrambled things. Naming is hard. So I'm going to share with you an exercise that I developed during my residency at the New York Public Library and that I have tested and refined with my design students at Parsons. It's an exercise in juxtaposing, mashing up, collaging, whatever you want to call it, text and image, to help us notice the unnameable gaps where words and language are often insufficient. It's about building a new vocabulary to be able to discuss and grapple with the beautiful mess that is the human experience. I call it text image insight. My students like to call it text material insight, or TMI for short, because it can feel like too much information in the best way possible. It's an exercise that can be done in a 2-hour workshop. It fits really nicely at the beginning of a project when you might want to be reviewing a client brief or testing its assumptions or getting up to speed on an industry. It also fits really nicely anytime we need to analyze or synthesize our research, anytime we want to make sense of all the weird and wonderful stuff we've come back with from the field, from interviews, etc. It's fast, it's effective, it's team building, it's insight generating, and importantly, it's fun. It has 3 steps: collect, match, define. Let's start with the first one, collect. So we want to start by setting a goal. What's the thing we want to understand? Maybe we want to get up to speed with an industry, as I mentioned earlier. Maybe we want to look more closely at a kind of activity or a context like competitive ballroom dancing or Harley motorcycle rallies. We want to set ourselves a goal. That goal will help us as we assemble a slew of diverse images and juicy quotes. These images and quotes can come from your field research, from interviews, from image archives like the picture collection. Images you make yourself are great. Any quotes you choose should be short, 1 to 3 sentences max. You want to be able to process them and read them quickly. You want to beware confirmation bias. This is something we talk about explicitly in the classroom because I, the teacher, am usually the one coming to class with the materials, and thus all the materials I bring have been filtered through the prism that is my brain, my aesthetic taste, my biases. Someone else given the same prompt with the same goal would inevitably select different images, and archives themselves are never neutral, which leads us to divide up the preparation work. Or if you're doing this exercise solo, be intentional about sourcing your images and quotes from a variety of sources. If you're working with a group, have everyone come to the table with 10, 15, 20 image references and 15 to 20 quotes from interviews or pulled from articles or client websites. And lastly, physical is best. You can absolutely do this exercise on a digital whiteboard like Miro or Mural, but ideas come more naturally when we're moving our bodies. So bring printed images, put your quotes on individual cards or slips of paper. So a few peeks into my classroom to see what this looks like in practice. Here we have a bunch of my students in the picture collection sifting through image folders. We're trying to decide what images to include in our exercises. And our goal for this exercise is to establish what we mean by the everyday. It's a class on design and everyday experience. What does everyday mean? This is important. Again, bring physical materials if you can. Here's a pile of the quotes that we used in this exercise. In this case, I pulled these quotes from past semesters of the same class. These are things that past students have highlighted in their readings, and so felt relevant to bring forward into a new semester. But you want to print your images. You want to put your quotes on individual cards or slips of paper. The shorter, the better. Step 2, match. This is where we get going. We want to pair text with image, image with text. Invite everyone in the group to begin matching one of the quotes with one of the images. This is a one-to-one thing, one image, one quote. Each should nuance and expand the other. The idea is that the textual excerpts expand our understanding of the images, and the images expand and nuance our understanding of the texts. As we go, we want to pull out the great matches, the resonant matches, the intriguing matches, pull them out of circulation and pin them up on a studio wall where everyone can see them. We're going to talk about them later. And finally, don't hurry the process. This takes time. It takes time to get to great matches. It's like affinity mapping, if that's a process you're familiar with. When you're sorting Post-it notes, you make a lot of tentative groupings. Those groups are fluid and provisional and only firm up as you return and return and return to the sorting process. Music also helps. Play some good music. So again, some peeks into the classroom to see what this looks like in practice. Here we are laying out an initial set of images. You can do this around a table, which is probably easier, or on a floor, as we did here in my graduate ethnography class. You want to set out more images than you have people participating. So there's no magic number, and it doesn't matter what images you pick. This is just to get us started. You want to put the rest of the images and quotes in a pile within easy reach. These are the buckets we'll be pulling from as we begin matching quotes with images, images with quotes. And then we go for it. If you're holding a quote, find an image on the table that you think resonates with the quote you're holding. Replace any quote that's already there with the one you're holding and keep going. And vice versa, if you're holding an image, find a quote on the table that you think resonates with the image you're holding. Replace any existing image with the one you're holding and keep going. Keep going is a refrain here. Some pairs change frequently, quotes replacing quotes, images replacing images. Some pairs don't change at all. Again, we're looking for pairs that feel like they are in conversation with each other, that they're saying something new to each other, not just repeating the same refrain. Keep going, keep matching. As the facilitator, you'll likely need to be the first person to pull that first set of a great pair out of circulation and to put on the wall. People will be tentative to do that at first, but if you show them that this is sort of how it works, people will start jumping in and pulling out the pairs that they're excited to talk about later. There's no right answer or magic sauce for what pairs to pull. I recommend listening to your gut. If it makes you say, huh, or if it makes you laugh, or if it makes you scratch your head and think, I hadn't thought of it that way, it's usually a good sign that there's something more to discuss. And so we're aiming for a critical mass. We're aiming for lots and lots of pairs, images and text, text and images. So here are some examples of the ones we pulled out and put on a board. And here's sort of where we paused in the case of one of my classes. You want to hit a critical mass because we're looking for patterns, and patterns appear in multiples. So as promised, here are a few examples of some of the text image pairs we've pulled out in past classes. So for context and a reminder, these come from an undergraduate theory class about design in the everyday and a graduate methods course on expanded ethnography. We ran this exercise in both cases at the beginning of the semester to establish a shared understanding of what everyday might mean, and also what it means to observe and document human experience. So our first example. We have a picture of a group of people in front of a Washington, D.C. row house. Paired with the image, we have a quote from Marianne van Helvert that reads, "I looked and saw that it was clean. I looked again and I realized it was dirty." We see here how the text expands and nuances and undermines our understanding of the image, and how the image expands and nuances and changes the scope of what we thought the text was referring to. We're now able to ask new questions about social dynamics, about how groups form, what makes for a healthy group, what makes for an unhealthy group, how appearances and actuality are not always in sync. Our next example. "It's not that I'm so smart, but I stay with the questions much longer." Albert Einstein. We see here the deliberate association of originally unassociated things. We're able to ask new questions about the practice of medicine, and if medicine is fundamentally about asking questions, and ask ourselves, what does it mean to stay with a question or to abandon a question, and the moral obligations thereof. And our final example. The look of things and the way they work are inextricably bound together, and in no place more than in cities. This is from Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Here we have a text that expands or nuances or undermines our understanding of the image again. We have a street scene that has at least 3 activities going on in it, and we're forced to ask, do these activities happen because the street is the ideal stage? Or do streets take the shape they take because of a certain pattern of human gathering? It's chicken egg, but we're starting to ask some really fun questions. And so that takes us to our next and final step, define. This is when we pause and stop as a group to discuss the resonant text pairs. What do we see? No observation is too obvious. And actually, I would argue that the observations that seem obvious are the ones we need to call out most. This is when we notice recurring themes, patterns, and questions, where we start to articulate what deeper truths the text image pairs are pointing towards. I usually ask someone to be a scribe during this moment so that we can save all the layers of the conversation to return to later. And this is when we start to use our new words, our new language, new patterns, new keywords to draft fresh insights. We want to begin articulating what's going on beneath the surface. And this should be easier now than it was at the beginning of the exercise. Because ultimately our goal is to build a new shared language. And if we need to invent new words, let's invent new words. And so some final peeks into the classroom to see what this looks like in practice. The way I begin this discussion is usually just to ask participants to notice aloud. Students will shout out, "I see a lot of women." Okay, great. Where specifically? Any guesses as to why? Or I see a lot of people in action doing work. Great. What kind of work? Are they alone, in groups? Or I notice a lot of scenes in streets. Awesome. Are there other kinds of settings or locations that we need to notice and call out? We'll do this for 15 to 20 minutes minimum. And this can be totally invigorating. You hear a lot of people and a lot of verbal, like auditory reactions where people are going, "Oh, that's great," when we happen upon a particularly satisfying pair. In the case of my everyday design class, we used our observations and notes and themes and keywords that came out of that, which you can see here, to draft new definitions for the everyday. And the outcome, sort of the long tail of this experience, is that we began the semester and spent a semester together with a shared understanding of what we meant by everyday and why those themes and topics are so important and relevant to everything we do as designers. Totally transformed the quality of conversation we were able to have. As we wrap up, I'd like to pause for a moment to consider some of the theory behind what's happening here. One person who thinks really beautifully about this is Scott McCloud, who wrote a phenomenal guide to how comics work, or really how visual communication works, called Understanding Comics. In the example you see here, you see 2 cells. On the left, the person in the background holding an axe is threatening the person in the foreground. On the right, you see a city skyline with "Scream" scrawled across the sky. Nowhere, like very literally, nowhere in front of us do we see an axe being swung or hitting a victim. But we can infer in the space between the 2 cells that an axe has indeed been swung and someone is now terribly hurt. We don't see it, but it happens. In comic speak, the location for where that happens is called the gutter, the space between the 2 cells. It's how we experience time in a static medium. The gutter is where everything happens. Gutter, gap, same thing. Here again is that quote from Lolita we looked at earlier. 2 words in the gap between them. That's all we need. The space, that gap, that gutter, almost vibrates. It's so rich with inferred detail. We're aiming for something similar, a whole wall of text image pairs that are similarly vibrant, equally resonant, where the gap between things feels full, where 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, but equals 17. And finally, I find poetry to be a really useful way into this conversation with students. It's a medium with which a lot of us are still uncomfortable. So we read it slowly or reluctantly. And because of that pace, it's easier to see how something can be multiple things simultaneously. In poetry, we're primed to believe that a rose may be both literally a rose and simultaneously something more than a rose. Naomi Shihab Nye is a poet I turn to often, and in this quote from an interview she gave with Poetry Magazine, she points explicitly to this moment of pause. I have always loved the gaps, she writes, the spaces between things as much as the things. Poetry calls us to pause. There's so much we overlook. Fundamentally, the exercise I just shared with you is about noticing what's happening in the gaps, about pausing. It's about paying attention and about paying attention to what we're paying attention to. Those gaps. The title of my talk today was How Combinatory Research Unearths Fresh Perspectives, Jumpstarts Research, and Challenges Assumptions. As we discussed, a shorter version of the title might simply be Great Things Happen When We Mash Ideas Together. But an even shorter version of this talk could be simply Mind the Gaps. It's where all the good stuff is. Thank you, and keep in touch.
Thank you so much, Killeen. That was awesome. So everybody, if you have questions for Killeen, put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them. We do have a couple in here already. So Killeen, this exercise sounds amazing, but if I'm a little worried that we don't get to interesting results, what advice or suggestions do you have to get the kind of results that you showed us?
That's a great question. I think that the inputs matter. I mean, to pull from your introduction, Nora, we have to prime ourselves for serendipity. And so I'm thinking about what images you're starting with, what quotes you're starting with. And so often, myself included, we head first to Google image search. But if you were to search happy in Google image search, you'll see a lot of yellow and black smiley faces. And so we want more variety than that. And so I would encourage people who are attempting to do this or who want to do this to think about how do you browse? How do you stumble upon? How do you graze rather than search as you're collecting your things? How do you let yourself be surprised by the world rather than seeking out a particular flavor of it? And I think like when you have fun stuff to pull together, fun stuff comes out of it. There's really no wrong way to make a match.
Good point. All right, next question. Related to what you just answered, what was the prompt given to the students at the front end of the experience that you just shared?
So the formal title of the class was Design Strategies in Everyday Experience. And so on that very first moment after taking attendance and figuring out like who was missing, who was there, I simply asked them to turn to a neighbor and guess, like, what do you think this class is about? Based on the title, Design Strategies in Everyday Experience. What is this class? And they chatted for a little bit, and then we came together back as a large group, and they threw out their sort of definitions for like what they thought this class covered, and they were all over the place, like totally. I don't think any of them had read the course description, which they never do. That's fine. And so we started there. We started by saying, this is what we think this class is about, but let's figure out, like, if this class is about the everyday, let's make sure we're looking at evidence from the everyday. Here's a whole bunch of images that I've brought to you from the picture collection. Here's a whole bunch of snippets from past semesters students in the same class. We're just going to get acquainted. And so think about the everyday, but then also see what matches you might want to make between image and text.
Very cool. Another one, do you think that there's any way for this exercise to be effective for virtual teams or groups?
Totally. Absolutely. I think one of the sort of potential hiccups with virtual matching. So Miro and Mural virtual, like digital whiteboards, are amazing. I've done this virtually, where you throw a whole bunch of images, digital images, up on a whiteboard and a whole bunch of text snippets. Where it gets a little hairy, actually, this isn't bad, but it's sort of lends itself to some unexpected results, is that in digital spaces, we can copy and replicate text and image really easily, which means that we may get 15 versions of that street scene of people doing Tai Chi in the street, and 6 different quotes matched with those 15 images. And it means that there's a little redundancy we need to work through, or we can really embrace that and say, there's a lot of ways we're clearly reacting to this image. What's common across those reactions, and how do we what do we want to do with it?
Okay. Another, you mentioned that this is a great exercise when you're getting into research synthesis. Are you thinking this is something to do before you start the synthesis exercises to get them to be more open to what they see in the research? Just curious how and when you see working around that research synthesis.
That's a great question. It's a great prompt. I think that whoever asked it, your instinct is totally right. Doing it at the beginning to remind ourselves what the goal of analysis and synthesis is to be surprised. If we already knew the answer, why were we doing the research in the first place? But to do that from the beginning and sort of prime ourselves to be hungry for future surprises, like, this is very satisfying. That would be a great moment to do it. You could also do it midway through, when you're stuck, you've hit a wall. You think that your insights are there, but they're a little tepid. They're not jazzy yet. And so you can return to the things you've brought back and see if there's more to unearth.
Makes sense. So I have a couple questions that are similar. So it seems pretty evident that younger generations have been getting more everyday exposure to mashing things up, right? Of ideas, artifacts, modern memes. So do you have any thoughts on how this might be influencing how young people approach learning in general? Or how the fact that they already do this in different contexts might impact their ability to benefit from this type of thing?
Another great question. It's true that the invitation to mash things up doesn't startle my young students. They're ready to go. I would say that their experience in mashing things up tends to come with a little bit of an agenda. The things that they're encountering online, or the things that they're making, they have a message they want to say. They're starting with the message and figuring out, like, what do I need? They're reverse engineering it. What are the 2 ingredients I need in order to sort of get this idea across, that I'm angry, or that I'm fun, or I'm having fun, or that this is weird and wonderful. And so I think this is a trend I've seen with a lot of my younger students. They want to know if they're doing something right. They want to know if they're doing something correctly, rather than trusting that they are. The only way out is through, and they just need to play, and patterns will reveal themselves. And so I think the impulse is, or the thing that we're working with and against, is less that they are familiar with mashups, but that they are unpracticed in trusting a process. They're unpracticed in letting them be surprised, that themselves be surprised.
Yeah, I could see that. Okay, another one. You mentioned it's important to be intentional about sourcing your images and quotes from a variety of sources, especially if you're working alone. Can you tell us a little more about why, and if you have any recommendations, especially for someone who might want to try and do this as a solopreneur?
Yeah. I mentioned sort of like that Google image search is both wonderful and dangerous earlier. If you're sourcing your images alone and you can't sort of rely on a group of people to bring, a group of perspectives to the table, making sure you're going to multiple engines, multiple sources. Google sorts their images and feeds you their images based on an optimization algorithm that we have no control over. And so if you look in Getty Images, or you look in Unsplash, or you look in Tumblr, or you look on Instagram, each of those are feeding you different flavors of images. There's a whole lot of self-similarity across all of these engines, but there's some subtle differences. I think I would, if wherever possible, I think I would recommend going physical, right? One of the great things, like one of the highlights of my time in the picture collection was when Jay, one of the librarians, came to me and with an image and asked for my suggestion on how to categorize it. And he asked, should this go in boats? Should this go in surrealism? Or should this go in fatherhood? And it could have fit in any of those spots. And it's a mark of sort of how wonderful physical collections are, because we can't put things in multiple places. We can't tag things the way we can digitally. And so when I open that fatherhood folder, I'm going to see boats, surrealist boats. And when I open that boat folder, I may see surrealist fathers. And like that surprise inevitably points you down new rabbit trails. So check a bunch of different places, compare what you're getting from those places, and if it's possible, go physical.
Okay. Building on that, although a little bit counter to your advice, how do you see AI playing into this?
I will admit that I need to do a whole lot more experimentation with AI, especially image generation. And I trust that, I mean, things have already changed so fast. I imagine they're going to continue to change at a speed that I can't even comprehend. But I feel like I can notice immediately when a student turns in a work generated by a generative AI program. There's a polish to it, or sort of like a fuzziness to it, or like a glow to it. I'm not entirely sure how to name it. Again, like naming is hard. But one day, I think AI will be wonderful. But AI or generative images, like it suffers from the same fault as like the same problem that Google image search. We're feeding a recipe into it and we're getting out precisely what we want, rather than not knowing what we're getting.
Yeah.
And I think that, yeah, that one-to-one is a little limiting.
Yeah. All right, another one. Have you ever used this in a non-research or non-classroom setting?
Non-research or non-classroom setting. I mean, I've done it for myself, I guess, just for fun. But no, I think and you're prompting me to wonder why I haven't, and sort of in what ways I could. But I think for me, what the payoff at the end, like when we land the plane, is what are we now able to say? And so like, what's the question we were asking we're now able to answer? And isn't that just what research is asking questions? And so maybe I've done it in settings you wouldn't recognize as research, but I'd see as research.
Perhaps maybe it's coming to a happy hour near you.
Maybe.
One last question. So when sourcing images and quotes, should you choose some initially that resonate with you, or pick at total random?
I think inevitably it's going to lean more towards the first, pick ones that resonate with you. And then you're going to try to be random, but inevitably it's going to be impossible to be random. I know that when I bring in pictures for students, for example, I'm very consciously trying to bring in images that represent the places my students come from. I'm trying not to bring in egregious nudity. Like these are college students, who cares? But like, I'm already filtering things based on sort of the setting I know that people will encounter these images in. I think as random as we try to be, we alone can't be random. There's always a method behind it.
Yeah. Not that different than Google in some ways.
I guess not. Well, that's depressing.
But we're better. All right.